Hello, welcome back to the Philip J. Curry Dinosaur Museum Virtual Speaker Series, where we have paleontology guest call in for a presentation on science, fossils, and dinosaurs, and where the public will be able to ask questions both here at the museum and live on YouTube after the talk. First off, we want to acknowledge that we are on the homeland of the many diverse First Nation and Métis peoples whose ancestors have walked this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to work, live, and learn on the traditional territory of Treaty 8. Today, we have Dr. Anthony Fiorillo presenting on the Late Cretaceous Dinosaurian world of Aniakchak National Monument, southwestern Alaska. Tony received his Bachelor of Science from the University of Connecticut, his Master's from the University of Nebraska, and his PhD in vertebrate paleontology at the University of Pennsylvania. Following this doctoral work, Tony was the Ray Postdoctoral Fellow at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and then a museum scientist at the Museum of Paleontology. Tony is currently a senior fellow at the Southwestern Methodist University. In his career, he has published over 120 scientific papers, authored a scholarly book on Alaskan dinosaurs, and co-edited 4 more volumes that were part of his research interests. He has also earned recognition through several awards, such as the 2000 and 2007 Alaska Region Natural Resource Research Award, the 2019 International George Wright Society's Natural Resources Achievement Award. In 2013, he was given the Distinguished Alumni Award by the University of Nebraska Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, and in 2008, he was named a Fellow of the Geologic Society of America. For over 20 years, Tony has led teams who have explored Alaska to study dinosaurs and their ecosystems in what is now known as ancient Beringia. For him, the appeal of the work in Alaska is the result of the combination of scholarly pursuit and the rigors of working in the Arctic and subarctic environment. Today, we will hear him speak on some of this research, including new fossil and track sites, what we have learned from these sites, and the paleoecological significance of these discoveries. Thank you for tuning in, and with that, I will let Tony take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Jackson, and thank you to the Philip J. Curry Dinosaur Museum for the opportunity to have this conversation this afternoon. Phil has actually been a good friend and colleague over the years, and some of the work that we're going to touch on, he contributed to. So it's a real pleasure to have this conversation today. I'm going to share my screen, and we can get started. So I am a senior, as you heard, I am a senior fellow at the Institute for Study Earth and Man at Southern Methodist University. And we're going to spend the last part, most of our conversation today, talking about the late Cretaceous dinosaurs of a place that most people have not heard of, called Aniakchak National Monument, which is in southwestern Alaska. I'm also formally affiliated with Hokkaido University in Sapporo, Japan. So I have 2 addresses. And while I was putting this talk together, I was thinking, this is also a little bit of a personal journey, so I thought possibly an alternate title, if that seemed too cumbersome, is just boil it down to Bones, Bears, and Bugs Catching Dinosaurs in the Far North. So because we're going to do a little bit of conversation about what it's like to work in such a remote place. This is a personal journey. This is how do you go hunting dinosaurs in the Alaskan landscape, and that's a 4 or 5-year-old version of me at the New York World's Fair, standing by the Sinclair dinosaur in the Sinclair dinosaur exhibit, and that's the Tyrannosaurus Rex of that time. And you can say that this journey that we're going to be talking about is really inspired in part because it's something that I never outgrew, and because of my exposure to the dinosaur world through the Sinclair Dinosaur exhibit, through the Peabody Museum at Yale, which is nearby where I grew up. But on a scientific perspective, why go to Alaska? And this is a fictitious journal, the Alaskan Journal of Pre-Pleistocene Vertebrate Paleontology, is because one of the things, this was touched on in my introduction, that as recently as 1980, somebody, this Patrick McClellan, could self-publish a paper on does the Alaskan record of land vertebrate fossils substantiate or contradict the long postulated existence of a Bering land bridge before the Pleistocene? And what is arguably the shortest abstract ever published, the answer is no. Meaning that despite the fact that we've known about dinosaurs since the early 1800s, as recently as 1980, there were no recognized dinosaur discoveries in the entire state of Alaska. And so to bring it home a little bit more, this is Bob Marshall, and he is a great conservationist from from New York State, and he spent time in Alaska, and he wrote in Arctic Village, blank spaces on maps had always fascinated me. And while this is a geologic map from 1913, if you see the word unexplored, 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 pretty much throughout this map, unexplored in terms of vertebrate paleontology would describe the huge state of Alaska. This is looking at a polar projection from the present. Here's Alaska. And if you go back in time, somewhere around 100 million years ago, the land bridge connection, Alaska, it's important to note that dinosaurs did not live somewhere else and were hijacked through plate tectonics into the north. They actually lived there. And this is the reconstruction of Alaska and its assembly about 100 million years ago. So the dinosaurs we're going to talk about were dwellers of the ancient high latitudes. And so that means that Alaska serves as if we understand what's going on up here, it serves as the gateway between faunal exchange between a place that Phil Curry knows very well, the Gobi Desert, Central Asia, as well as most of you in Alberta. The dinosaur faunal connection between these two places occurred through Alaska. So understanding something about Alaska helps inform us about what dinosaurs were doing on two major land masses. So before we go much further, because we're going to cover a little bit of ground in Alaska, most people in the US see Alaska this way. There's the iconic 48 state map of the US. And Alaska is tucked here in the corner, and it sort of has the appearance of being about the size of Hawaii without really perspective. When in fact, to scale, which is what this map is, Alaska goes from coast to coast and border to border. It is 20% of the United States geographic area. And it's so huge that if you walk the streets of Anchorage, almost any tourist shop likes to make fun of its size compared to Texas. It's about 2.5 times the size of the state I live in. And you know what Texans oftentimes think about their home state. It's a little bit humbling to be in a state that big. So how did you go about hunting dinosaurs in a place that big? And some people would argue that divine intervention sometimes plays a role, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But came across this sign, dinosaurs didn't read, now they're extinct, coincidence. The real core of the question of how you go about looking for dinosaurs is you start with library research. And this is old school with actual books versus Google or Scholar searches on your computer, but you really have to do everything you can in the library and bibliographic resources to improve your probability of success. And then once you actually have figured out where you want to go, you have to figure out how to get there. You either hike, you take a boat, once in a while you can drive, you charter a small plane and get into the places you want to go. And then of course you have to have everything flown in or boated in. You set up a camp, and this is along the Colville River right back here on the north slope of Alaska, and this is the same camp just a week or so later. So you are willing to tolerate camping under a number of conditions. And the people oftentimes talk about the Arctic as being a lonely place, but really it's not. You're always kept company This is a couple pages from my field notes from 2005, and you can tell this is a particularly mosquito-y year. I didn't try to catch the mosquitoes in my book. It was just as I jotted things down, closed the book, I'd open it again, and there's another mosquito. So sometimes you do wish the Arctic was a little lonelier than it actually is. And so we've had 20 plus years of success, and I do need to introduce a couple of people who've played a role in this success. The key collaborators are people like Dr. Paul McCarthy, who's the head of the geology department at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and Dr. Yoshi Kobayashi at Hokkaido University. Yoshi is a former student of mine. These two guys have played a huge role in the success that I'm about to talk about. But they're not alone. These are some of the key cooperators. And some of these people spent time in the field. Some of them were doing their expertise in the lab, and my dog is included because I talk to him all the time, bouncing ideas off of him when we go on walks. And he politely just wags his tail. The rocks we're interested in are within the Mesozoic era, and specifically it's the Cretaceous. And more specifically, it's the latest Cretaceous. So we're going to travel through the state a little bit, but we're always going to talk about late Cretaceous rocks about 70 million years old. The first place we'll go is up here on the north slope, which is where some of the more famous dinosaur bone beds are. Here's the Prince Creek Formation, and this is how you drive to work. And these are the rocks that have produced most of the dinosaur bones from Alaska that you may have heard about. This is an example of one of those bone beds. Here's a ceratopsian skull, and there's the occipital condyle. The nose is down here. And from this excavation, you have incredibly dense, blocks of rock that contain dozens and dozens of bones. And if you wonder how you get tons of material off the top of a bluff in the middle of nowhere, it's you use a helicopter. Here's that quarry that produced the horned dinosaur skull that I was just telling you about. The helicopter's lowering a cable down. There's somebody here rolling a jacket into a sling net. And this guy over here is using a radio to talk to the helicopter pilot because he can't see what's going down here. This site has produced animals like the pygmy tyrannosaur Nanuqsaurus and the horned dinosaur Pachyrhinosaurus, which is different than the Pachyrhinosaurus that you're probably familiar with. This is a different species, Pachyrhinosaurus perot-orum. Other dinosaurs that we have found in these bluffs include Troodon, and this is something that Phil Curry, we wrote a paper together with a couple of other people on the occurrence of Troodon, and there's a partial brain case of a small predatory dinosaur. And of course, the most common bones we find up here belong to a duck-billed dinosaur that's known as Edmontosaurus, and there's thousands and thousands of bones, and this is mostly juvenile material, so we actually don't know the species name. But the big question, of course, with respect to these Arctic dinosaurs is, did they live there all year round, over winter, or did they migrate? And you may have been following the Alaska dinosaur story last year. My team, we talked about this particular baby dinosaur jawbone of a dromaeosaur, and here's some brilliant artwork by Andrei Avtuchin. And then this past spring or summer, another team discovered more baby dinosaur material. So it seems like there's a lot of evidence that juvenile dinosaurs were thriving in the ancient north, and so they were year-round residents. And so it's up to us to figure out what was the adaptation like for these dinosaurs to live up north year-round. Another place that we're going to go is into south central Alaska in the Alaska Range and look at the lower Cantwell Formation in Denali National Park. And that's the tallest mountain in North America, Denali, which was recently renamed, and appropriately so. And again, Late Cretaceous, this is the rock unit. This is what it looks like. The upper Cantwell Formation is this reddish stuff. which is actually Paleocene and it's volcanic. Doesn't have dinosaurs, so we're not going to spend time with it. But this gray material here is the lower Cantwell Formation, representing ancient rivers and floodplains. Here's a camp. There's Yoshi Kobayashi and Steve Hasiotis from the University of Kansas. And this, if you're wondering, is an electric bear fence that when the park first had us going out in the backcountry, they insisted we take it. I don't know how well you can see this little red thing here, but this whole thing, which is supposed to deter a 600-pound grizzly bear, is run on 2D batteries. So we didn't actually have a whole lot of faith in it, but we put it up because the Park Service told us to. And they eventually said we didn't need it anymore. So I'm going to show, really, the rest of this talk is going to talk about footprints. So I'm going to show you some footprints. And if you're not used to footprints, some of them will be depressed and some of them will be raised up. And so you might wonder, how is that possible? Here's a depressed footprint, as you would normally expect to see a footprint. But when a dinosaur walks across the surface, you see it creates the footprints that you see when you walk across mud that gets filled in and then buried and compressed. And if the material that fills in the footprint is harder than this material below it, what you end up with is the impression of a footprint. So it's a raised feature. If this is harder than that, then you get a depressed feature like here. So that's how you're going to see some prints that are raised and some that are depressed, and that's how that's happening. One is the most likely actual footprint. The other one is the infilling of the footprint. But if I can pause in Denali for just a moment, since this is October 16th and just 3 days ago, the National Park Service about 10 or 12 years ago created the National Fossil Day. And it's a big thing in the US, and a number of organizations like the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, like the American Geological Institute, we all celebrate this day. And for the first time ever, and there's a unique logo for each year. So for 2021, it was a dinosaur logo with footprints, and it was to celebrate the dinosaur footprint record at Denali National Park, which started in 2005 with the team's discovery of this is a dinosaur footprint, middle toe, side toe, side toe. And this is us excavating it in 2005. And if you're in Denali someday, go into the visitor center and you can see this block still on display. There's more exhibits about dinosaurs, and here's a mural that reflects the entire project that we've worked on. But there are literally thousands of dinosaur footprints in Denali, and it was celebrated on this year's National Fossil Day. This is one of the most incredible footprint localities in Denali. Here's a bedding plane. And as things go in paleontology, we discovered this literally on the last day. And the next day, the helicopter came to pick us up. But the winds were terrible. And so the helicopter pilot didn't want to hover over this. He just wanted to pull us out and get us to safety. So we were left that year wondering, how do you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of rock that look exactly the same, superimposed with so many dinosaur footprints? The next year, we were able to go in, the weather was calm, and we discovered that what it actually was a single bedding plane, but it's breaking up, sliding down the mountains. So the wrong earthquake at the wrong time could send this track site, which is truly remarkable, thousands and thousands of footprints, down the mountain and into the river. So they let us come in the following year with LiDAR equipment and huge amounts of molding compounds. And so we did our best to record this track surface. If you're familiar with LiDAR, there's a laser that comes out of here. These are stations that you're bouncing signals off of, and you're trying to record a digital representation of that surface. Unfortunately, this is the surface. And ideally, there's someplace over here where you set up the LiDAR station, so you're bouncing the signal as close to perpendicular off the surface as you can. So obviously there's nothing out here. So our project had only limited success with LiDAR. but we were able to capture a huge amount of information with more traditional methods. And what do I mean? I've said the surface is incredible. When you walk on it, it feels like you're stepping back 70 million years ago and walking the actual landscape, because you see all kinds of things on this surface, like coprolites. And we know they're coprolites because A, they kind of look like coprolites, and B, this is an X-ray fluorescence readout. The elemental analysis says that they have the same main elements that you see in things like cow manure. So we have, you're walking across a 70 million year old cow pasture, if you will. But what's really cool is you have big tracks, medium-sized tracks, baby tracks. Most of the tracks have skin impressions. And so you're looking at a multi-generational herd of dinosaurs walking across the landscape. And it is suggesting parental care. And here we've got, scientists, we have to plot things up. Here's a length width measurements, and you see the data cloud. And we thought that these statistically broke out into 4 stages of dinosaur growth. And when you plot them up, you can see that if you compare it to the histology work that's been done on some dinosaurs, you have a window where there's some slow growth, and then just like humans, teenage years is a spurt of growth, and then it slows up as you get into more adult time. So we thought that our track site helped support this growth curve based on dinosaur bone histology, which we thought was really cool because it's always nice to have multiple data sets come together. So let's go to Aniakchak National Monument. Now this is way down here, and this is a place very few people actually ever get to visit. So I have a short video. We were laughing in that video because Yoshi Kobayashi snuck a drone up behind us, and it's sounded like we were so intently looking at the rocks that we thought that was the biggest mosquito we'd ever heard, and then we looked up and saw it was the drone. Aniakchak is a national park unit because of the volcanic history of the park. This is a giant caldera. It's about 6 miles across, and it formed a couple thousand years ago. But as recently as the 1930s, and this is a National Geographic 1931, a geologist who was also a Jesuit priest, Father Bernard Hubbard, explored the inside of the caldera shortly 6 months after an eruption. I don't know if you'd catch me doing that, but there's a short film called The Adventures of the Glacier Priest. That was his nickname. And he was, in the 1930s, he was a superstar in exploration, doing product endorsements like this camera, which is in a magazine. And again, he was a Catholic priest, so of course you'd have a Catholic mass while you're doing your field work. And this is a picture of the eruption, or 6 months after the big eruption in Aniakchak in 1931. And it's a smoking inferno. And if you read Father Hubbard's accounts, it's very, how can we put this? There's a lot of hyperbole that makes one smile. It's very Flash Gordon-esque, if you're familiar with that story. This is the inside of the caldera today. And in 2001, I had the good fortune of partnering with the National Park Service to do the first dinosaur survey in this park. This is Surprise Lake. We flew in by float plane, and we were able to go from Surprise Lake and follow the Aniakchak River down to Aniakchak Bay. And that is the estuary right there. And at the end of that trip, this is how you leave the raft. We assemble the rafts, go out the gates, follow the river. It's a wild whitewater trip until you get down towards the end. Obviously, the water calms down, and then it becomes a very passive experience. And it was in these rocks, literally in the last 2 hours of the project, the float plane is in the air to pull us out, that I found the first dinosaur footprint in the park. And it was also the very first dinosaur record of any kind in any national park in the state of Alaska. So it was something that was a big deal in 2001. The Chignik Formation crops out in several places. You can see the outline of the park, crops out in several places, but the easiest place to get to is right there on the coast. This is that footprint, and there's 1 toe, 2 toes, 3 toes of the hind foot. There's a little crescent-shaped moon here for a hand impression, and there's another hand impression there. This is a track that we published on in 2004. There's a plaster cast with a laser scan from that time, and it looks like the footprint slid a little bit before it came to a stop. And that was what launched the entire project in the Alaska National Park System, to the hunt for dinosaurs. But it is a hard place to get to. And it literally has about 100 visitors a year. The National Park Service has fun with that. If you go to the Aniakchak website, it says no lines, no waiting, because nobody can. It's an expensive place to go to, and logistically it's very challenging, as well as the weather is notoriously bad. But you are out on your own, so you have to be pretty independent. And you share the landscape with, you see plenty of these guys. Here's a beach where you can see our footprints, and walking alongside us are some grizzly bear footprints. Because there's so much salmon, these are the big bears. They're somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200 pounds a piece. And there are some people who work on tracks that look at parallelism in trackways as evidence of gregarious behavior, group behavior. But I can assure you that at no point did we walk this close to a grizzly bear. So I'm a little skeptical about all this gregarious behavior from dinosaur trackways. But going back to the bear and the fact that you have to be pretty independent, you have to carry a bunch of tools with you to be ready for almost anything. And the most important one are these binoculars to try to see a potential problem before it's too close. So in the Chignik Formation, there are these fluvial channel systems. The original track was actually found about where Yoshi is sitting. There's Yoshi, there's Paul McCarthy, and this is a good weather day, obviously. And if you walk through the section from the oldest to the youngest, you go from nearshore marine rocks into more fluvial rocks. And here you can see some marine shells, some marine invertebrate trace fossils. And then as you get up into this area highlighted by red, you start to find, here's a tree, an upright tree with a root mass. You see lots of fossil leaves. Here are some flowering plant leaves with insect damage on it. So you've got little herbivores eating some of the leaves in a forest. These forests seem like they're mostly gymnosperms or conifers. This was an exciting leaf that we found this past summer. in that it's close to a modern chestnut. We haven't figured out exactly what yet, or a chestnut or hickory. And those trees only, today's relatives only live in the lower latitudes. So to us, this is a paleoclimate indicator, indicating that it was warmer back in Aniakchak some 70 million years ago. Here are some more leaves. Here's that upright tree. And so we've got, there's another kind of invertebrate insect trace fossil on that leaf. And so what we feel like is we have a near shore beach environment that changes as we go up section into a more fluvial system dominated by river channels. And conveniently, the Aniakchak estuary seems like the exact modern analog of what we're looking at 70 million years ago, complete with modern dinosaurs doing taking advantage of the resources of the estuary. How do we record what we think we've seen? Here are some, here's a dinosaur footprint in cross section. Here's one of the times we found a bedding plane with various footprints in it. So we do, you know, tape measure, record. And then when tracks are of particular note, we use a silicone molding compound and make rubber molds. It is a beach, so you have to be very wary of the tides. And so here are Dr. Kobayashi and Dr. Tanaka making a mold of a footprint. This was the first time we really tested this. Here's our hadrosaur footprint, the tides coming in, and we weren't sure what was going to happen, if that would be there, because that went completely underwater by high tide. And when we were done, the molding compound held up very nicely. So we have a lot of faith in that molding compound. But things move on, you know, making molds of footprints are one thing, but we've also gone to doing things with photogrammetry. This is that original track. You see there's that middle toe, 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 that crescent hand track. And this is a digital representation of the original track found, which is still there. And we've moved a little bit more towards capturing our footprints this way. And it's obviously it's an accurate representation of our tracks. So we're using a lot of batteries for drones. This is a old bunkhouse, not very big, but it is a solid sided sheltered. When the weather changes, it's much nicer to be in here than in your tent. We get our laptops up and try to look at the day's data. So how do we keep our batteries charged? Solar panels, but setting them up outside the cabin, you know, the sun moves and the panel needs to move too. So how do we keep our batteries charged using solar panels so we can adjust over the course of the day? That is where we take advantage of our graduate students. This is now Dr. Junki Yoshida, and he was more than happy to carry our solar panels on his back through the course of the day to help recharge our batteries and keep the project going. So what are we finding? This is a paper that is open access. It's in +1 if you're interested, and I can give you the information. But here's the a cast of that mold that you saw that went underwater during high tide. And so here's a line drawing. It's a set of tracks where one footprint is overlain by another one. This is a substantial hadrosaur track. You see 1, 2, 3 toes, and there's little babies. Here's artist reconstruction. But the tracks that we're finding go from babies to full-blown adults. So the hadrosaurs would seem to be very happy doing what they were doing, what they needed to do when they were living in Aniakchak some 70 million years ago. Other dinosaurs, we found a few of these very rare, but Tetrapodosaurus that are attributed to the armored dinosaurs. We found evidence of a larger dinosaur, predatory dinosaur, that if you do this measurement and go to hip height and then to body length, you're talking about an animal that may have been about 19, 20 feet long, 7 meters long, 6 to 7 meters long, which is about the size of Nanuqsaurus. I don't know if that's Nanosaurus, we're a long way away, but it's about what we're talking about. And then there were a bunch of birds, crane-like birds, Magnoavipes, and shorebird-like things, modern shorebirds. And so we've got a couple of kinds, there's a little bit of bird diversity there. But what is very interesting is that almost 94% of all of the tracks can be attributed to hadrosaurids. And so it seems like hadrosaur families like to go to the beach. So what are we working on now? That's the cabin, and we walk this every day and share it with the bears. We've taken this from a single isolated footprint to now we have about 110 track sites in these areas, and they fall into 3 main areas. And if you look at the size distribution of the duck-billed dinosaur footprints in each of these areas, and here they are, the profiles are a little bit different. Sometimes you have a bunch of young, and then all the way up to you get a full age profile, and other times you're really only selecting for one body size. So what we're trying to understand now is what is contributing to this. Is it the local environment, or is it the local climate that might be playing a role in some sort of habitat preference for these dinosaurs? And that's kind of where our minds are right now. And based on the work we did in last July, we'll be chewing on that all winter to try to figure out what we think we might know. And so I'm going to wrap this up by just acknowledging several partners. The National Park U.S. National Park Service has been a huge help for this project. This is that cabin in Aniakchak. The U.S. National Science Foundation, National Geographic, and some private donors have been very helpful in moving our project forward. And hopefully this work helps inspire, if there are any young people in the audience, inspire the next generation of scientific explorers to go out there and try to find things that may not be known now, because that's what's fun. And so this is a Tyrannosaurus from the New York World's Fair with me as a 5-year-old. This is the same sculpture at Dinosaur Valley State Park, about an hour and 15 minutes south of Dallas in Glen Rose, Texas. And there's my daughter, about 5 or 6 years old. She's now grown up, but hopefully this helps inspire the next generation. And if you are interested in knowing more about the Alaska dinosaur story, there's a book out. Here's how you can find it. I wrote it, came out in 2018. And this is a dinosaur I named Dinosaurus. If you're familiar with the Roman god Janus, I try to make the case that looking to the past and the warm Arctic can possibly help inform the future, what global warming is doing for a warming Arctic today. And then there's my Twitter handle, which you can follow me on Twitter. And so with that, I'll turn it over for any questions that might be out there.
Thanks, Anthony, for a really interesting talk. We learned quite a bit, and yes, there are quite a few questions that came in through it.
Okay.
The first one is from Christian. What was Nanuqsaurus's role in the Cretaceous Alaskan ecosystem, and were there other theropods like Troodon or Dromaeosaurus present?
The answer to the question is, we'll take the second part first, which is there were other predatory dinosaurs in Alaska at this time. And actually, in comparison to places like Alberta, Montana, and all the way down to Texas, Troodon is a fairly rare dinosaur. But what's so interesting about Alaska is that it is, in fact, the most commonly found predatory dinosaur in the late Cretaceous of Alaska. And why is that? Well, Troodon it still has the biggest eye orbit to body size of any dinosaur. So it seems well adapted to low light conditions. And so we made an argument that means that it was a pre-adapted dinosaur as it came from Asia into North America, that it was pre-adapted to the high latitudes. And so it was allowed to thrive in a way that gave it a competitive advantage over things like dromaeosaurs, which are also there, but they're extremely rare. So what's also interesting about Troodon is if you accept that it was the most common predatory dinosaur, it actually had a bigger body size compared to the Troodon you find in Alberta or Montana or Texas. And so we argued that this competitive advantage allowed it to grow to a bigger body size. It may be twice as big as what you're used to seeing with that animal. Nanoqsaurus is a tyrannosaur, and it had, as all good tyrannosaurs, an enhanced sense of smell. And so it had a certain amount of dwarfism. It's about half the size of Tyrannosaurus rex. And so what we argued in the paper about Nanoqsaurus is that the ancient Arctic was choosing for an optimal body size that Nanoqsaurus, representing Tyrannosaurus, converges on, and Troodon is converging on for living in that ecosystem. I still would not want to run into either one of them, but it's hard not to think of Nanoqsaurus as probably the orneriest predator of the ecosystem, but Troodon was the most common predatory dinosaur you'd find up there.
Thank you. There's next question. I believe it's in relation to the baby dromaeosaurid you mentioned earlier, but
Right.
the question is it only known from the bottom jaw?
There are other parts that, with respect to predatory dinosaurs, when you only have fragments, having teeth and some jaws are the most diagnostic. There are other pieces in the collection, including baby hadrosaurs, but you can't get very specific about who they are. We use that jaw just for that paper because it had the most taxonomically diagnostic information with it, but there are other baby dinosaur materials.
Okay. Next question. Can the tracks you discovered further support the idea of migratory behavior among dinosaurs and settle the debate over the dinosaur physiology, like whether warm or cold-blooded?
That's a great question. I think what the tracks are telling us, both in Denali National Park and in Aniakchak, they corroborate what we think we see up on the North Slope, which is that dinosaurs lived in these latitudes year-round, and they were able to raise their young and do the things they needed to do to be the self-sustained population of dinosaurs. Now, migration is, when they were first found, and there were dinosaur footprints found in Svalbard, for example, and then Bonnet Plume, which is north of you guys, that it presented questions about what we thought we knew about reptilian physiology. This just didn't fit. And so they started invoking, some of the early studies were invoking things where they were making dinosaurs caribou and going on long distance migration, 6,000-7,000 kilometers to the south. Well, the problem is caribou don't go this way. They kind of go this way. And so we did a paper where we looked at the biomechanics of migratory animals today and compared it to what we thought we saw in these Alaskan hadrosaurs. And we said, biomechanically, if you use modern animals, it doesn't work with the dinosaur world. So when you think of, so when we use the word migrate, I think we do accept that, like caribou, and like you would expect any big group of herding animals that eat plants, they have to move. Otherwise, they're going to strip all the vegetation out of an area and run out of food. So their migrations were of a much smaller scale than this north-south model to get out of the winter. We have plenty of evidence that suggests they were there year-round. And one more thing I'll throw out there is the bones, for example, of Edmontosaurus from the North Slope. When we compare them to the bones of Edmontosaurus found in Alberta, we find the hint of growth rings in the Alaskan ones and not in the Edmontosaurus of Alberta, which suggests that these dinosaurs were regulating their growth, presumably dependent on the availability of food. So when food was scarce, they were slowing down their metabolism, and you're seeing that in the cell structure of the bone. The footprints, because you asked the question about the footprints are telling us, just like that baby dromaeosaur, because we're finding baby footprints, that these dinosaurs were rearing their young in the ancient north. But I don't think any of it tells us much about warm-blooded versus cold-blooded.
Thank you. Okay, next question, was the crater at Aniakchak active when you recently did field work there?
Thankfully, no. But the beach is filled with pumice cobbles that some volcano somewhere along, it's part of the Ring of Fire. You find plenty of evidence of fairly recent volcanic activity, but when we're there, we haven't seen any.
Well, that's good to hear.
I agree.
Okay, next question. Are the Aniakchak footprints contemporary with the lower Cantwell trackways?
To the best information we have available, yes. It doesn't necessarily mean that the same day, week, or month that the tracks in Denali National Park occurred at the same time in Aniakchak. But all of our dating techniques, do from fossil pollen to volcanic ash dates to, you name whichever is your favorite one. We think we're somewhere within the 70 million year window. So they could be thousands of years apart, but we're very close in terms of time, but we can't say for sure that they were exactly, it's a scale issue, a temporal scale issue, but they're as close as we can tell.
That makes sense to me. Okay, next question. Are you hoping to find any complete or semi-complete remains of dinosaurs you found through the tracks in your future work at Aniakchak?
We will be going back, and we would love to find skeletal material because it is, it's first of all, there's no dinosaur bone material from anywhere in that immediate area. So we're making extrapolations with dinosaur skeletal material that's about 1,500 kilometers away from where we're working. So you can imagine there's a certain tenuousness to that. So when you've heard me talk about the duck-billed dinosaurs of Aniakchak, I've tended to refer to them as the hadrosaurs as opposed to Edmontosaurus. And there's a number of reasons for that. So we're very happy with finding the footprints, because what I like to tell people is that footprints really tell us something about the behavior of a dinosaur. It is the actual physical representation of how that extinct animal interacted with its environment. Bones will tell you, for example, who was at a dance, but the footprints are telling you what they were dancing. And so I like working with both. And it would be ideal to find some skeletal material so we know who's at the dance in Aniakchak. So we're hopeful, but we haven't found any yet.
All right. Next question. Let's see. Because most of the tracks were hadrosaurs, does that likely show species abundance and show the first step of ecological dynamics between predators and prey in Cretaceous Alaska?
Could you repeat that question?
Okay. Because so most of the tracks you found are hadrosaurs, does that show likely species abundance and show the first step of ecological dynamics between predator and prey in Alaska? I'm assuming, what does that tell you about how many, the different species abundances and how they were interacting?
Well, the herbivorous populations of animals, whether it's the bones on the North Slope or the tracks in Denali or the tracks in Aniakchak, herbivorous dinosaurs are the most common. And that's really kind of something you see in the modern environment too, that plant eaters outnumber meat eaters. So we're seeing this kind of consistency through time. The fact that we find so many hadrosaurs in Aniakchak in these very, very coastal environments does suggest that hadrosaurs, they preferred the beach. They thrived in these coastal lowland environments. We haven't found anything that looks like a ceratopsian footprint, for example, in a place that we have very tight control on what the depositional environments are like. So that suggests that the horned dinosaurs were living perhaps in a drier upland environment, which is exactly what we see from the bone distributions that we see on the North Slope, that the coastal uplands were dominated by ceratopsians, while the coastal lowlands are dominated by hadrosaurs. So we do see some habitat preferences between the main herbivores, and the stuff that we're doing in Aniakchak supports the bigger regional model.
Okay, I hope that made sense and answered our question asker's question. The next question is, speaking of Magnoavipes, do you believe it is a bird or a dinosaur? I know some Magnoavipes look like birds and some look like dinosaurs, so I'm curious, could they be separated or not?
Well, there's certainly a fair amount of controversy about Magnoavipes. It was originally described from down here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and it was described as a crane-like bird, and I've seen the original footprints, and I believe that it's a crane-like bird. And so in the paper we published in 2019 on Aniakchak tracks, and it's in +1, so it's open access, so anybody that's listening can go look for it. In the supplemental files, what we did was we had what we felt was Magnoavipes, and then we had to decide, is it a bird or is it a avian theropod or a non-avian theropod? And we went through multiple, by now, there are a number of guides for tracking modern birds, where, and they're really wonderful guides that outline different kinds of birds from North America, from Africa, from Europe, and they help people identify the tracks they're seeing. So we looked at the argument that Magnoavipes was a non-avian theropod, and there was a list of criteria. And we then went into these track guide volumes and measured dozens and dozens of different kinds of bird footprints. And one by one, the arguments against Magnoavipes being an avian theropod sort of fell away, from size to angles between the toes, to you name it, they just all fell away. And it's really spelled out in text and graphics in the supplemental file in that 2019 paper. So to answer your question, I believe Magnoavipis was a crane-like bird as originally described. And then there are some other things that have been called Magnoavipis with different ichnospecies names that I actually don't think belong with that genus. And that's a whole other conversation that could fill the afternoon.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in from our audience. Or wait, no, there's just one that came in. Following the question about the identity of Magnoavipes, were these shapes of the tracks indicating shorebird lifestyle or something else?
Sorry, say that again.
Following the question about the identity of Magnoavipes, were the shapes of the tracks indicating shorebird lifestyle or something else?
There's one of the other things we touched on in this paper was, well, cranes do what cranes do. So since we're finding them in the near shore environments, these animals probably were living along the coastline. And the other thing that we touched on, were they flightless birds or could they fly? And so we went deep into some of the literature where, for example, moas, some of the early descriptions and figures of moa tracks. And based on the way the toes are with their long skinny toes as opposed to bigger muscular toes, we argued that Magnoavipis was a bird that could fly as opposed to a flightless bird running around. So we think, at least in Aniakchak, it was a coastal bird and it was capable of flying.
Okay, so yeah, again, haven't seen any other questions come in, but there's one question we always like to ask our speakers, and that's, what's your favorite dinosaur or other prehistoric species?
My answer to that question is my favorite dinosaur is the one that I'm working on at the moment. And that's not necessarily to be flip, but I'm fascinated by all this stuff in the high latitudes that whatever I'm working on is what my favorite thing is. And then I move on to the next one. If you asked me that when I was a kid, because I grew up going to the Yale Peabody Museum, which is famous for horned dinosaurs, those were my favorites when I was a kid. So you can imagine when we named the new species of Pachyrhinosaurus about 10 years ago, it was really achieving the childhood dream of how cool would it be to find a new horned dinosaur someday.
Well, I don't see any other questions come in, so I think with that, we're going to conclude our question period. I'd like to thank Dr. Anthony for joining us today and presenting a very interesting topic on Alaskan paleontology and relating back to his childhood favorite species. Stay tuned till next Saturday at 12 p.m. when we will have Dr. Michael Ryan join us for the next virtual speaker series, where he will be presenting on the horned dinosaurs of Canada. So it's a nice little tie-in. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us and have a nice day.